The DNA results landed in Detective Sarah Chen's inbox at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March 2024. She had been staring at this case file for 18 months, and she almost didn't open the email. Almost. Her finger hovered over the mouse. Click. The page loaded. And there it was, a name she recognized. A name that made her stomach drop and her hands shake. The killer had been there all along. At the vigils, at the memorials, cleaning the very floors where Jennifer Walsh had walked to her final class. 50 years ago, the night was quiet in the Springfield Police Department's cold case unit. Sarah sat alone in the fluorescent glow, the hum of the ancient computer the only sound. She read the name again. Robert Henderson. Match probability. 99.9997%. The old janitor. The man who had helped search for Jennifer. The man who had attended her funeral. Sarah's coffee had gone cold hours ago. She pushed it aside and reached for the phone. This call would wake up a lot of people. This call would finally bring answers to a family that had waited half a century for them. But first, she needed to understand how they had missed him. How everyone had missed him. She opened the case file from 1974. The yellowed pages smelled of old paper and forgotten promises. Jennifer Walsh smiled up from a black and white photograph, frozen at 19 forever. Dark hair, bright eyes. A college girl with dreams of becoming a teacher. Sarah had studied this photo for months now. Had come to know every detail of Jennifer's face, her life. Her final day. What Sarah didn't know yet was that this case would unravel 50 years of carefully constructed lies. It would reveal not just one crime, but a lifetime of deception. And it would prove that some secrets, buried deep in the Ozark Hills, eventually find their way back to the surface. But to understand how they caught him, you have to go back to where it all began. Back to October 15, 1974. The autumn air in Springfield, Missouri hung thick with the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves. Southwest Missouri State College campus buzzed with students hurrying between classes, their voices echoing off brick buildings that had stood since the 1920s. It was a Tuesday evening, just after 6 o'clock, and the sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jennifer Walsh gathered her books from her American literature class. She was a sophomore, working toward her teaching degree, and she loved this time of year. Her professor, Dr. Catherine Morrison, noticed Jennifer lingering by her desk. "Good discussion today, Jennifer," Dr. Morrison said, shuffling her own papers into a worn leather satchel. "Your analysis of Fitzgerald was particularly insightful, eh?" Jennifer beamed. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. I've been reading ahead. I can't put it down." "That's the mark of a true literature lover," the professor replied. "See you Thursday." Jennifer left the classroom at 6:47 p.m. Multiple students would later confirm this timing. She wore bell-bottom jeans, a rust-colored sweater, and carried a macrame purse her mother had made. Her long dark hair was pulled back with a tortoise-shell clip. She had a shift at the campus library that started at 7:30. She was never late. She never made it to work. The walk from Strong Hall to the library should have taken 12 minutes. Jennifer's roommate, Lisa Patterson, would later tell investigators that Jennifer always took the same route across the main quad, past the student union, through the parking lot by the maintenance building. It was well lit. It was busy. It should have been safe. But October 15, 1974, was not a normal night. Robert Henderson had been mopping the floors in Strong Hall's basement since 5 o'clock. He was 49 years old, a quiet man who had worked at the college for 15 years. People barely noticed him. That was how he liked it. He pushed his mop and bucket through empty hallways, invisible in his gray janitorial uniform. And he watched. He always watched. He had seen Jennifer Walsh dozens of times over the past 2 years. watched her hurry to classes, laugh with friends, study in the library where he cleaned the windows. She was kind to him, one of the few students who actually said hello. That kindness would be her undoing. At 7:15 p.m., the campus library supervisor called Jennifer's dorm room. No answer. Lisa wasn't worried yet. Jennifer sometimes lost track of time. But by 8 o'clock, when Jennifer still hadn't shown up and wasn't answering pages over the campus intercom system, Lisa's concern grew into something darker. She called Jennifer's parents at 8:30 p.m. Thomas and Margaret Walsh lived 40 minutes away in Branson, Missouri. Thomas worked at a hardware store. Margaret was a nurse at the local hospital. Jennifer was their only child. Their miracle baby, born after years of trying. The center of their world. "I'm sure there's an explanation," Thomas said, but his voice carried an edge Lisa had never heard before. "We'll drive up right now." By 9 o'clock, they were filing a missing person report with the Springfield Police Department. Officer Dale Michaels took their statement. He was young, new to the force, and he tried to reassure them. "Most college kids turn up within a few hours," he said, pen poised over his notepad. "Usually they're at a party or with friends." "Jennifer doesn't party," Margaret said sharply. Her nurse's training kept her voice steady, but her hands trembled. "She's responsible. She's dedicated. Something is wrong." Thomas paced the small police station lobby. "She was supposed to call us tonight. Every Tuesday night, 7:30, like clockwork. She didn't call." Officer Michaels sensed their genuine fear. He escalated the case to Detective Frank Morrison, no relation to Jennifer's professor. Morrison was a 20-year veteran with deep lines around his eyes and a reputation for never giving up on a case. He took the report seriously from the start. "Tell me everything about her day," Morrison said, settling into a chair across from the Walshes. "Every detail matters." What they didn't know at that moment was that Jennifer was already dead miles away. Deep in the Mark Twain National Forest, Jennifer Walsh's body lay in a shallow grave covered with leaves and fallen branches. The forest was dense here, a tangle of oak and hickory trees that grew wild across the Ozark Hills. Robert Henderson had driven for 40 minutes after leaving the campus, his hands steady on the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup. Jennifer's body wrapped in a tarp in the truck bed. He had done this before. The thought came unbidden as he dug the grave, his shovel biting into the soft earth. Not killing, this was his first, but he had imagined it so many times that it felt like memory. The planning, the watching, the perfect opportunity. She had been walking alone. The parking lot by the maintenance building had been empty. He had called out to her, "Miss Walsh, could you help me a moment?" And she had turned with that kind smile. Always so kind. She had approached his work truck without hesitation. He struck her from behind as she bent to look at what he was pointing to. One blow with a tire iron. She dropped without a sound in the cab of his truck. Driving away from campus with no one noticing, no one suspecting. Robert Henderson felt something he hadn't felt in years. Power, control. Finally, after watching for so long, he had acted. The strangulation came later in the forest, to be sure. To be certain. Her eyes had opened briefly as his hands closed around her throat. She had tried to speak his name, Mr. Henderson, but he squeezed tighter. It took longer than he expected. Much longer. But eventually, she stopped struggling. He smoked a cigarette while he dug, the nicotine steadying his nerves. He crushed the butt under his work boot and tossed it into the grave without thinking. Then he rolled Jennifer's body in and covered it with earth. He was back home by 11 o'clock. His wife was already asleep. He showered and climbed into bed, and when sleep wouldn't come, he stared at the ceiling and felt nothing at all. The search for Jennifer Walsh began at dawn. October 16th. Detective Morrison organized teams of volunteers, students, faculty, local residents. They searched the campus building by building, then expanded into the surrounding neighborhoods. Dogs tracked her scent from Strong Hall to the parking lot by the maintenance building, then lost it. She got into a vehicle here, Morrison told his team on day 3. Someone picked her up or forced her into a car. Robert Henderson joined the search on day 2. He carried his lunch in a brown paper bag and walked grid patterns through the woods north of campus with other volunteers. He looked concerned. He told everyone who asked that Jennifer was such a nice girl, always polite, such a tragedy. "I hope they find her safe," he said to another searcher, a professor from the English department. Such a terrible thing. Nobody suspected the quiet janitor. Why would they? He had no criminal record. He was married. He was helpful. He was invisible. Lisa Patterson organized a vigil on the campus quad 1 week after Jennifer's disappearance. Hundreds of candles flickered in the October darkness. Jennifer's parents stood at the center, Thomas's arm around Margaret's shoulders as she wept silently. Students read poems. The college chaplain led a prayer. Robert Henderson stood at the back of the crowd, his face appropriately somber. He watched Margaret Walsh cry and felt nothing. Or perhaps he felt something satisfaction, maybe, at the power he held. The secret he carried. They were all looking for Jennifer, and he was the only one who knew exactly where she was. Detective Morrison worked the case relentlessly. He interviewed over 300 people in the first 2 weeks. He checked alibis, followed leads, chased down reported sightings that all turned out to be false. A girl matching Jennifer's description was seen in Memphis, not her. In Little Rock, not her. In Tulsa, not her. Us. She didn't run away, Morrison told Officer Michaels. Someone took her. Someone who knew her routine. They compiled a list of every person who had regular contact with Jennifer. Her professors, her classmates, the library staff, the cafeteria workers, the maintenance crew. Robert Henderson's name appeared on that list. He was interviewed on October 29th, 2 weeks after Jennifer's disappearance. "Did you see Jennifer Walsh on October 15th? Morrison asked, his notepad open. "I saw her going into her evening class," Henderson replied. His voice was steady. He had practiced this. "I was cleaning the hallways in Strong Hall. I didn't see her leave." "What time did you finish your shift that night?" "Around 8:30. "I always clock out at 8:30. Morrison checked the time cards. Henderson had clocked out at 8:34 p.m., his supervisor confirmed. He had been working his usual areas that evening. Nothing seemed unusual. "Did Jennifer ever speak to you?" Morrison continued. "Sometimes she'd say hello. She was polite. Not like some of the students who look right through us cleaning people." Henderson's face showed appropriate sadness. "I really hope you find her." Morrison had no reason to doubt him. The janitor checked out. He moved on to other suspects, a boyfriend who had seemed possessive, a professor with a reputation for inappropriate comments, a maintenance worker who had been fired the previous month for drinking on the job. The weeks turned into months. Winter came early that year, covering Springfield in snow and ice. The search continued, but hope faded like footprints in fresh powder. Margaret Walsh stopped sleeping. Thomas Walsh aged 10 years in 10 weeks. Lisa Patterson transferred to a different college in January. Unable to bear walking past Jennifer's empty dorm room. On November 6th, 3 weeks after Jennifer vanished, a hunter found her body. Ray Coleman was tracking deer in the Mark Twain National Forest when his dog started digging frantically at a disturbed patch of ground. Ray approached, thinking perhaps the dog had found a dead animal. Then he saw the hand. He ran back to his truck and drove until he found a payphone. His voice shook when he called the police. "I found a body," he said. "A girl." In the forest off Highway 76, Detective Morrison arrived at the scene within an hour. The area was already cordoned off with yellow tape. Crime scene photographers documented everything. The medical examiner, Dr. Helen Cartwright, knelt beside the shallow grave. Female, approximately late teens to early 20s, she said, her voice clinical but gentle. Based on decomposition, I'd estimate she's been here about 3 weeks. Morrison's jaw tightened. Is it Jennifer Walsh? Dr. Cartwright looked up. I'll need to confirm with dental records, but based on the clothing description, I believe so. The rust-colored sweater was still visible. The McCrane purse lay nearby, its contents scattered. Thomas Walsh would later identify the tortoiseshell hair clip. The official identification came 2 days later. Jennifer Walsh had been strangled. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of her skull. She had been killed shortly after her abduction. Dr. Cartwright estimated time of death at approximately 8 p.m. on October 15th, possibly as late as 9 p.m. She didn't suffer long, Dr. Cartwright told the Walshes privately, though she wasn't entirely sure this was true. But they needed to hear it. They needed something. The forensic team processed the gravesite meticulously. They found tire tracks near Bifford pickup, common model, hundreds in the area. They found footprints, men's size 10 work boots, also common. They found fibers, soil samples, leaf samples, and they found a cigarette butt. It was partially buried near where Jennifer's body had lain. Pall Mall brand, smoked down to the filter. In 1974, DNA analysis was still years away from practical use in criminal cases. The cigarette butt was logged into evidence, photographed, and stored. It seemed like a dead end. Half the men in Missouri smoked, and Pall Mall was a popular brand. We'll keep everything, Morrison said. Technology changes. Maybe someday this will mean something. He had no idea how right he was. The investigation intensified after Jennifer's body was found. Morrison's team worked 16-hour days. They re-interviewed everyone from the original list. They expanded their canvas to include people who frequented the area where Jennifer's body was discovered. Robert Henderson was interviewed again on November 12th. Where were you on the evening of October 15th between 7 and 11 p.m.? Morrison asked. I was at work until 8:30, like I told you before, Henderson said. Then I went home. My wife can confirm I was there by 9:30. Morrison checked with Mrs. Janet Henderson, a tired woman with graying hair and resigned eyes. She confirmed her husband had been home by 9:30. She had been watching television. He had showered and gone to bed. Does your husband smoke? Morrison asked. He quit last year, she said. Doctor's orders. High blood pressure, but Henderson had lied. He had smoked that cigarette standing over Jennifer's grave. He had quit after that night. The murder, his last cigarette, though no one knew the connection. He had thrown away his remaining pack of Pall Malls and never bought another. Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. He studied the evidence boards in the station. Jennifer's smiling face at the center, red string connecting facts and possibilities. The case consumed him. His wife complained he never came home. His children barely recognized him. But he couldn't let it go. Someone at that college knows something, he told his partner, Detective James Rivera. Someone saw something. They questioned the entire maintenance staff again. Every janitor, groundskeeper, and facilities worker. Robert Henderson remained cooperative and unmemorable. Just another middle-aged man with a mop and bucket, doing his job. Expressing appropriate concern, the case went cold by spring of 1975. Detective Morrison never officially closed it. He kept the file on his desk, kept working it when other cases allowed, kept hoping for a break. But leads dried up. Witnesses moved away. Life moved on, indifferent to the Walsh family's grief. Thomas and Margaret held a funeral on November 20th, 1974. Jennifer was buried at Maple Park Cemetery in Springfield. The college planted a tree in her memory. Her dorm room became a scholarship fund. Her professors spoke at memorial services about her bright future, now extinguished. Robert Henderson attended the funeral. He stood in the back, wearing his only suit, and watched them lower Jennifer into the ground. He felt a strange sense of completion. She belonged to the earth now, just as she had in the forest. Everything was as it should be. He went back to work the next day. He mopped floors and emptied trash cans and remained invisible. He was careful after that. He never acted on his impulses again. Jennifer had been enough. The memory of her last moments sustained him for years. The cigarette butts sat in the evidence room, logged and forgotten. Case number 741847. One cigarette butt among thousands. Of pieces of evidence from hundreds of cases, waiting years past like water through fingers. 1,980. 1,990. 2000, the world changed around Springfield. But Jennifer Walsh's case remained frozen in time. A cold case in a growing stack of unsolved murders. Detective Frank Morrison retired in 1998. He was 73 years old. And Jennifer Walsh's file was one of 3 cases he had never solved. It haunted him until his death in 2003. He left a note with his personal papers. Never stopped looking. Never stopped caring. Someone knows what happened to Jennifer Walsh. Thomas Walsh died of a heart attack in 1989. He was only 62. Margaret always said it was a broken heart that killed him, not his arteries. She lived until 2018, 44 years after her daughter's murder. She never moved from their house in Branson. She kept Jennifer's bedroom exactly as it had been in 1974. She lit a candle every October 15th and sat in the darkness and remembered. Someone knows, she would say too. Anyone who would listen. Somewhere, someone knows what happened to my baby. Robert Henderson retired from Southwest Missouri State, now Missouri State University in 2004. He was 79 years old and had worked at the college for 45 years. They gave him a small retirement party in the break room. They gave him a plaque and a cake. People smiled and told him he would be missed. Though most of them barely knew his name. He moved to a modest house on the outskirts of Springfield with his wife, Janet. Their marriage was a quiet thing, devoid of real intimacy or connection. They had no children. Janet suspected, in the way wives sometimes do, that her husband carried secrets. But she never asked, and he never told. Henderson spent his retirement years watching television and working in his small garden. His hands, once strong enough to kill, grew arthritic and weak. His hair went white. His face grew lined and weathered. He looked like what he was, an elderly man living out his final years in forgettable obscurity. He thought about Jennifer Walsh sometimes. Not with guilt. He was incapable of that particular emotion, but with a kind of detached nostalgia. He had been powerful once. He had controlled life and death. Now he could barely open a jar of pickles. He never expected to be caught. 50 years had passed. Everyone who remembered the case was dead or dying. The evidence was surely lost or destroyed by now. He was safe. He had always been safe. What he didn't know was that science had been waiting to catch up with him in 2012. A young police detective named Sarah Chen transferred to the Springfield Police Department's newly formed cold case unit. She was 32 years old, ambitious and driven by a personal tragedy that had shaped her career choice. Her younger sister had been murdered when Sarah was 15. That case had been solved, the killer caught and imprisoned. But the experience had planted a seed. Sarah wanted to be the person who brought answers to families still waiting. She wanted to be the closure they desperately needed. The cold case unit was understaffed and overwhelmed. Boxes of unsolved cases lined the walls, dozens of files, yellowing with age. Sarah's partner, Detective Mike Torres, was a veteran with 30 years on the force and a cynical outlook born of too many dead ends. "Don't get too attached to any one case," he warned Sarah on her first day. "You'll go crazy if you do." But Sarah had always been the type to get attached. She started systematically reviewing old cases, prioritizing those with potential DNA evidence. The science had advanced dramatically since the 1970s. What had been impossible in 1974 was now routine. The challenge was finding cases with preserved biological evidence and enough material to test Jennifer Walsh's file caught Sarah's attention in September 2022, 48 years old. She murmured, reading Morrison's detailed notes. College student disappeared after class. Body found 3 weeks later. Strangled. She kept reading. The crime scene report mentioned a cigarette butt. Logged into evidence. She checked the evidence logs. The cigarette butt was still there, preserved in a sealed evidence bag, tagged with case number 741847. "We should test this," Sarah said, holding up the report to Mike. He barely looked up from his own paperwork. "You know how backed up the lab is? Could take months." "Then we start now." Sarah requested the evidence. 3 weeks later, a small plastic bag arrived at her desk. Inside was a yellowed evidence envelope containing one cigarette butt, remarkably well preserved after nearly 5 decades. Pall Mall, Sarah noted. Popular brand in the 70s. She sent it to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Laboratory with a request for DNA analysis. Then she waited. The wait stretched from weeks to months. The lab was indeed backed up, just as Mike had warned. But Sarah was patient. She used the time to rebuild Jennifer's case from the ground up. She tracked down everyone who was still alive from the original investigation. She interviewed Lisa Patterson, now in her 60s, living in Seattle. She visited Jennifer's grave and stood for a long time reading the headstone. Jennifer Marie Walsh, 1955 to 1974. Beloved daughter. Gone too soon. She found Margaret Walsh in a nursing home in Branson. The old woman was 92, frail, her mind starting to slip. But when Sarah mentioned Jennifer, Margaret's eyes cleared with sharp focus. "Have you found him?" Margaret whispered. "Have you found who killed my baby?" "I'm trying," Sarah promised. "I won't give up." Margaret gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "I prayed every day for 50 years that someone would care enough to keep looking. I prayed God would send someone." Sarah left that visit shaken. She had always taken her work seriously, but now it felt sacred. She had made a promise to a dying woman. She intended to keep it. The DNA results came back on November 3, 2022. Usable. DNA had been extracted from the saliva on the cigarette butt. They had a full profile. The lab technician, a young woman named Dr. Lisa Hoffman, called Sarah personally. "The DNA is excellent quality," Dr. Hoffman said. "Remarkably well preserved. We ran it through CODIS." CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was the FBI's national DNA database of convicted offenders and arrestees. It was the first place to check for any DNA profile. "No matches," Dr. Hoffman continued. "Whoever smoked this cigarette has never been arrested or convicted of a crime." Sarah felt disappointment wash over her. "So it's another dead end." "Not necessarily," Dr. Hoffman said. "Have you heard of genetic genealogy?" Genetic genealogy was the cutting-edge intersection of forensic science and family history research. It had famously broken the Golden State Killer case in 2018. The principle was simple but revolutionary. Upload DNA to public genealogy databases like GetMatch. Find genetic relatives, build a family tree, and work backward to identify suspects. "It's a long shot," Dr. Hoffman explained. But if our unknown subject has any relatives who've done recreational DNA testing, we might be able to narrow down who he is. Sarah authorized the genetic genealogy approach in December 2022. The DNA profile was uploaded to GetMatch, law enforcement portal. Then came more waiting. Dr. Hoffman worked with a genetic genealogist named Rebecca Stone, an expert who had helped solve a dozen cold cases. Rebecca was in her 50s, a former librarian who had found her calling in genetic detective work. She was meticulous, patient, and brilliant at constructing family trees from fragmentary evidence. "We have several third and fourth cousin matches," Rebecca reported after the first week. "That's actually good. Close enough to be useful. Distant enough that there are probably multiple suspects we'll need to investigate." She began building the family tree. Working backward from the genetic matches, she constructed branches spanning 5 generations. She used census records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses. She traced the family lines across Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma. It took months. Sarah checked in weekly, feeling the pressure of time. Margaret Walsh was declining rapidly. She might not have much time left. "I need to give her an answer," Sarah told Rebecca in March 2023. "Even if it's not the answer she wants. She deserves to know we tried." "I'm getting close," Rebecca promised. "I've narrowed it to 3 family lines. All have men in the right age range who were in Springfield in 1974. By June 2023, Rebecca had identified 7 possible suspects, 7 men who fit the genetic profile, the age range, and the geographic location. Sarah began the painstaking process of eliminating suspects and building cases. 5 of the men were eliminated within weeks. 1 had been in the military, stationed overseas in 1974. 2 had died decades ago. 1 with documented medical conditions that would have made the crime physically impossible. Another 2 had solid alibis. 1 had been hospitalized with appendicitis during the relevant time period. The other was documented at a family reunion 300 miles away. That left 2 suspects. John Davidson, age 77, a former electrician who had worked on campus in 1974, and Robert Henderson, age 73, a former janitor who had worked at the college for 45 years. Sarah pulled all available records on both men. Neither had criminal records. Both were married. Both had lived quiet, unremarkable lives. She needed more evidence to narrow it down. Sarah requested DNA samples from both men. This required legal maneuvering. They couldn't compel samples without probable cause. But they could obtain samples through what investigators called abandonment DNA. They watched both men, discreetly, legally, waiting for either to discard something that might contain DNA, a coffee cup, a cigarette, but ironic, Sarah thought, a used napkin. John Davidson was the easier target. He was a regular at a local diner where he drank coffee every morning and left his cup on the table. Sarah's team recovered the cup on August 14, 2023, and sent it for testing. No match. Davidson was eliminated. That left Robert Henderson. Henderson was more challenging. He rarely left his house. When he did, he was careful with his trash, taking it directly to the bins, never leaving anything behind in public. His wife handled most errands. He seemed to live like a ghost. Leaving no trace, Sarah had to get creative. She learned that Henderson had a standing appointment at a medical clinic for his arthritis. On September 28, 2023, Sarah posed as a clinic staff member, legally questionable but within the bounds of investigation, and retrieved a cotton swab Henderson had used during his examination. The sample went to the lab on September 29th. Sarah barely slept while waiting for results. Every hour felt like days. Every day felt like years. Margaret Walsh died on October 2, 2023. She was 93 years old. Sarah attended the funeral, standing in the rain at Maple Park Cemetery, watching them bury Margaret next to her daughter and husband. The headstone would read, Margaret Ann Walsh, 1930 to 2023, reunited with her beloved Jennifer. Sarah stood at the grave for a long time after everyone else had left. The rain soaked through her jacket, but she barely noticed. I'm close, she whispered to the headstone. I'm so close, Margaret. I'm going to find him. The DNA results came back on October 18, 2023. Sarah was in a meeting when Dr. Hoffman called. She excused herself and took the call in the hallway. We have a match, Dr. Hoffman said. Robert Henderson's DNA matches the cigarette butt from the crime scene. The probability of coincidence is less than 1 in a trillion. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. You're sure? I'm absolutely certain. The DNA on that cigarette butt came from Robert Henderson. Sarah returned to her desk and pulled every file on Henderson. She spent the next 4 months building an airtight case. She couldn't arrest him on DNA alone. She needed to connect him to Jennifer. To the crime scene, to the time and place. She found his employment records. He had been working that night, had access to the area where Jennifer disappeared. His time card showed he had clocked out later than usual at 8:34 p.m. instead of his usual 7:30 p.m. She found his truck registration from 1974. Ford F-150. The tire tracks at the scene were consistent with that model. She interviewed people who had worked with him. Slowly, a picture emerged. A quiet man. A watchful man. A man who seemed to take particular interest in female students. He gave me the creeps, said Dorothy Williams, a retired secretary who had worked at the college. Nothing I could point to specifically, but the way he looked at the girls. It wasn't right. Sarah interviewed Henderson's wife Janet in January 2024. Janet was 74. Worn down by decades of marriage to a man she barely knew. Did Robert smoke? Sarah asked casually, among dozens of other questions. He quit in 1974, Janet said. November, I think. Just suddenly stopped. I was surprised he'd been trying to quit for years. Then one day he threw out his cigarettes and never touched another one. November 1974. Right after Jennifer's body was found, Sarah conducted surveillance on Henderson. She watched him shuffle through his daily routine, an old man who looked harmless. But she knew better. She had learned that monsters rarely looked like monsters. By March 2024, Sarah had everything she needed. A detailed timeline, DNA evidence, circumstantial evidence, witness statements, the truck registration, the smoking habit that stopped exactly when Jennifer's body was discovered. She prepared the arrest warrant on March 19, 2024. Exactly 49 years and 5 months after Jennifer Walsh's murder. Sarah led a team to Robert Henderson's house. It was early morning, the sun just rising over Springfield. The neighborhood was quiet. Sarah knocked on the door. Robert Henderson answered in his bathrobe, confused and annoyed at being disturbed so early. Robert Henderson. Sarah said, her voice steady. Yes. I'm Detective Sarah Chen with the Springfield Police Department. I have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of Jennifer Walsh. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, Henderson's mask slipped. Sarah saw recognition in his eyes. Not surprise. Not confusion. Just ... recognition. He had been waiting for this for 50 years. Then the mask returned. I don't know what you're talking about. If your DNA says otherwise, you're under arrest. The arrest of Robert Henderson made national news. A cold case solved after 50 years through cutting-edge genetic genealogy. The story captured public imagination, the dogged detective. The innovative science, the patient hunt for justice. But for Sarah Chen, it wasn't about headlines. It was about the promise she had made to Margaret Walsh. It was about a 19-year-old girl who had deserved to live. Henderson's arraignment took place on THL, My Only Lipstick, Lie Blus. While My Only Lipstick, Ruby Kiss, Only Ruby Kiss has March 22, 2024. He pleaded not guilty, which surprised no one. His public defender, a weary man named Marcus Webb, filed motions to suppress the DNA evidence, arguing the genetic genealogy method violated Henderson's privacy rights. The hearing stretched through the spring. Legal experts debated the ethics and legality of genetic genealogy databases. The judge, a careful woman named Patricia Moreno, ultimately ruled the evidence admissible. The technology was too new for definitive precedent, but the public interest in solving cold cases outweighed privacy concerns when used within legal frameworks. Henderson sat through the hearings expressionless. He never showed emotion. He never showed remorse. Sarah watched him carefully, trying to understand what drove a man to kill and then live normally for 5 decades. She never found a satisfying answer. Some people, she concluded, were simply missing something fundamental that made them human. The trial was set for September 2024. Sarah spent the summer preparing with the prosecutor, an experienced attorney named David Park. Park was in his 50s, known for his methodical approach and his ability to make complex forensic evidence understandable to juries. "We have the DNA," Park said during one of their preparation sessions. "That's our foundation. But we need to tell Jennifer's story. We need the jury to care about her, not just see her as evidence." Sarah had boxes of materials: Jennifer's journals, her college papers, photographs, letters home to her parents. She had built not just a case, but a complete picture of who Jennifer Walsh had been, a real person with dreams and fears and hopes. The trial began on September 9, 2024. The courthouse in Springfield was packed. True crime enthusiasts traveled from across the country. News cameras lined the steps. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Jennifer's family filled one row: distant cousins, friends of her parents, Lisa Patterson, who had flown in from Seattle. They had waited 50 years for this moment. Opening statements painted two opposing narratives. Park described a predator who had hidden in plain sight, who had used his position of trust to select and kill a vulnerable victim, who had smoked a cigarette over her grave with such arrogance that he never imagined science would one day reveal his identity. Webb, Henderson's attorney, argued reasonable doubt. Yes, Henderson's DNA was on a cigarette at the scene. But he was a smoker who worked at the college. Perhaps he had been in that area of the forest for legitimate reasons. Perhaps he had simply discarded a cigarette that happened to land near where someone else had later buried Jennifer. Coincidence, not evidence. It was a weak argument, and Webb knew it. But it was all he had. The prosecution's case took 3 weeks to present. Dr. Hoffman testified about the DNA analysis, walking the jury through the science in clear, simple terms. She explained how DNA works, how it's preserved, how matches are determined. She showed probability calculations. The chance of the DNA being anyone other than Robert Henderson was less than 1 in a trillion. Rebecca Stone, the genetic genealogist, testified about building the family tree. She showed her painstaking work, the genealogical charts, the process of elimination. She explained how she had narrowed down from hundreds of potential matches to one name. Robert Henderson, the tire track expert, testified that Henderson's 1974 Ford F-150 was consistent with tracks found at the burial site. Former coworkers testified about Henderson's behavior, the watching, the attention he paid to female students, the way he always seemed to be nearby. Janet Henderson testified for the prosecution. Her testimony, devastating. She described her husband as cold, distant, emotionally unavailable. She described his sudden decision to quit smoking in November 1974. She described finding a tortoiseshell hair clip in his truck shortly after Jennifer disappeared. She had asked about it, and he had said he found it in a hallway and forgot to turn it in to Lost and Found. "Did you recognize that hair clip?" Park asked. "Not at the time," Janet said quietly. "But when I saw Jennifer Walsh's photo in the newspaper after they found her body, she was wearing a clip that looked just like it." The courtroom was silent. "Why didn't you report this to police?" Park asked gently. Janet's voice broke. "I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself my husband couldn't have. I've lived with that guilt for 50 years. Sarah took the stand near the end of the prosecution's case. She testified about the investigation, about the careful work of building the case. She talked about meeting Margaret Walsh, about the promise she had made. "Why was this case so important to you?" Park asked. Sarah glanced at the family row, at Lisa Patterson, who was crying silently. "Because Jennifer Walsh mattered. Her life mattered. Her dreams mattered. She deserved justice, and her family deserved answers. It's been 50 years, but it's never too late to do the right thing." The defense's case was brief. Henderson did not testify Noib's advice, though Sarah suspected Henderson simply had nothing to say. He had lived behind a mask for so long that removing it was impossible. Webb called character witnesses who described Henderson as quiet, reliable, unmemorable. He called a forensic expert who tried to cast doubt on the DNA evidence, suggesting contamination or error. But the expert was not convincing under cross-examination. Closing arguments took place on October 7, 2024. Park reminded the jury of every piece of evidence, every testimony, every connection. He showed them photos of Jennifer vibrant, alive, smiling. He showed them what was left after Henderson finished with her. "Robert Henderson took Jennifer Walsh from her family 50 years ago," Park said. "He took her dreams, her future, her life. He thought he'd gotten away with it. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. But DNA doesn't lie. Science doesn't lie. The evidence doesn't lie. Robert Henderson murdered Jennifer Walsh, and now, finally, it's time for him to answer for that." Webb's closing was perfunctory. He reminded the jury of reasonable doubt, of the possibility of coincidence, of the burden of proof. But his heart wasn't in it. Even he seemed to know it was over. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom on October 8, 2024, the tension was suffocating. Sarah sat rigid in her seat, barely breathing. Henderson showed no emotion, his face a mask of indifference. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Marino asked. The forewoman stood. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Robert Henderson, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Lisa Patterson sobbed openly. Family members hugged each other. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She had promised Margaret Walsh. She had delivered. Henderson's expression never changed. He sat motionless as the verdict was read, as the judge ordered him remanded to custody, as bailiffs led him away. If he felt anything regret, anger, fear, he didn't show it. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Robert Henderson, now 73 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die there. He would never be free again. Judge Moreno addressed him directly before pronouncing sentence. "Mr. Henderson, you took Jennifer Walsh's life when she was only 19 years old. You robbed her of 50 years she should have lived, 50 years of birthdays, Christmases, graduations, perhaps a career, a marriage, children of her own. You robbed her parents of watching their daughter grow up. You caused immeasurable pain to everyone who loved her. And then you went on living your life as if nothing had happened. You showed no remorse. You never confessed. You never gave her family any peace. The law allows me to sentence you to life imprisonment, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." Henderson was led away to begin serving his sentence at the Missouri Department of Corrections. He would likely never see the outside of a prison again. After the trial, Sarah visited Jennifer's grave. It was late October, almost exactly 50 years since Jennifer had died. The autumn air smelled of wood smoke and dying leaves, just as it had in 1907, for Sarah placed flowers at the base of the headstone sunflowers, which Lisa Patterson had told her were Jennifer's favorite. "We got him," Sarah said quietly. "Your mom lived long enough to know we were close. She believed we'd find him." She was right. The wind rustled through the cemetery trees. Sarah stood there for a long time, thinking about the case. About justice delayed but not denied. About a cigarette butt that had waited 50 years to tell its truth. Before she left, Sarah placed something else at the grave, a photograph of the Walsh family from 1973, a year before Jennifer died. Thomas, Margaret, and Jennifer on a summer day, smiling at the camera. A family intact, happy, before Henderson took everything from them. "Rest in peace," Sarah whispered. "All of you. Rest in peace." The Jennifer Walsh case became a landmark in cold case investigation. It demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy combined with determined police work. Within months of Henderson's conviction, the Springfield Police Department received funding to expand their cold case unit. 3 more decades-old cases were solved using similar techniques. Detective Sarah Chen received commendations from the Missouri Attorney General and the FBI, but the recognition she valued most came from Lisa Patterson, who wrote her a letter that Sarah kept in her desk drawer. "Thank you for caring about my friend when so many others had forgotten. Thank you for keeping your promise to Jennifer's mother. Thank you for proving that some people still believe in justice no matter how long it takes." Robert Henderson died in prison on January 15, 2025, 3 months after his sentencing. He was 73 years old. He never confessed. He never showed remorse. He never explained why he killed Jennifer Walsh. Some questions, Sarah realized, would never have satisfying answers. The Springfield News Leader published Henderson's obituary with a single line: "Robert Henderson, 73, died in custody while serving a life sentence for murder." Jennifer Walsh's obituary, republished alongside Henderson's death notice, was much longer. It talked about her dreams of becoming a teacher, her love of literature, her kindness, her bright smile, the life she should have lived. The contrast was stark. One life remembered with love. One remembered only for the evil it had done. 1 year after the trial, on September 9, 2025, Missouri State University held a special ceremony. They dedicated a new scholarship in Jennifer Walsh's name, a full-ride scholarship for students pursuing education degrees. They planted a garden near Strong Hall, where Jennifer had taken her last class. They installed a plaque with her photograph and a quote from one of her college papers. "The purpose of education is not just to fill minds with facts, but to open hearts to possibility. Every student deserves a teacher who sees their potential and helps them reach it." Sarah attended the dedication ceremony. The current students probably didn't know the full story of Jennifer Walsh's name from before they were born. A tragedy from another era. But they would benefit from her scholarship. They would walk past her garden. And in that way, Jennifer's dream of becoming a teacher had come true. She was still touching young lives, still making a difference. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself standing alone in the parking lot by the old maintenance building. This was where Henderson had called out to Jennifer, where he had struck her, where her life had ended. Sarah thought about the choices that led to that moment. Henderson could have chosen differently. He could have let Jennifer walk by. He could have been a normal person living a normal life. Instead, he chose violence. He chose murder. And 50 years later, that choice caught up with him. The parking lot was full of students now. Young people heading to classes, living their lives, pursuing their dreams, just as Jennifer had been doing. The normalcy of it struck Sarah's life continues. How the world keeps spinning, even after terrible things happen. Her phone buzzed. A new cold case assignment. A missing woman from 1982. DNA evidence available. Sarah looked at the case file on her screen, then looked back at the parking lot where Jennifer Walsh had disappeared. "I'll find them," Sarah said quietly, a promise to the new victim. A new family waiting for answers. "I won't give up." She got in her car and drove back to the station. There was always another case. Always another family waiting. Always another promise to keep. But on her desk, beneath a stack of case files, was the photograph of Jennifer Walsh smiling at the camera. A reminder of why she did this work. A reminder that every victim had been a real person with a real life. A reminder that justice mattered. No matter how long it took. 50 years had passed between Jennifer Walsh's murder and Robert Henderson's conviction. 50 years of waiting, hoping, grieving. But in the end, the truth emerged. DNA preserved in a cigarette but told the story. Henderson thought he'd buried forever. Science had finally given Jennifer Walsh a voice. And that voice had spoken across 5 decades to say one thing: remember me. I mattered. I lived. And my killer must answer for what he did. Justice delayed, but never denied. In Springfield, Missouri, there's a small memorial garden on the campus of Missouri State University. Students study there on warm afternoons, sit on benches beneath shade trees, walk paths lined with seasonal flowers. Most don't know the garden's history. Most don't know about Jennifer Walsh, but those who do know understand something important: that every person matters. That every life has value. That justice is worth fighting for, no matter how many years have passed. Detective Sarah Chen drives by that garden sometimes on her way to work. She thinks about Margaret Walsh, who waited 44 years to know her daughter's killer would be caught. Margaret didn't live to see the trial, but she died knowing the case wasn't forgotten. That had to be enough. She thinks about Jennifer, frozen at 19 forever, but remembered as more than a victim. Remembered as a daughter, a friend, a dreamer. A person with a future that was stolen but never forgotten. And she thinks about all the other cold cases. The other families waiting, the other victims whose voices are waiting to be heard. She thinks about cigarette butts and DNA strands and genetic genealogy and the patient. Painstaking work of building family trees across generations. Technology changes. Science advances. What was impossible becomes possible. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the truth emerges. The Jennifer Walsh case proved something that law enforcement had believed but couldn't always demonstrate: that time doesn't erase evidence, that killers can't hide forever. That justice might be delayed, but it's never truly denied. Somewhere in evidence rooms across America, there are cigarette butts and coffee cups and envelopes sealed with saliva. There are items collected 50, 60, 70 years ago by detectives who knew technology would someday catch up. Those detectives are mostly gone now, but their work remains, and someday, when the technology advances even further, when new techniques emerge, when dedicated detectives refuse to give up, those pieces of evidence will speak. They will tell stories that have been silent for decades. They will give voices to the forgotten victims. They will prove, once again, that justice matters, that every life matters, that 50 years or 500 years, it's never too late to do the right thing. Jennifer Walsh's story ended in 1974, But her legacy continues in every cold case that gets solved. Every family that gets answers, every detective who refuses to give up. Her garden blooms every spring. Her scholarship helps students every year. Her name is remembered not with pity, but with respect. And somewhere, Robert Henderson sits in a prison cell, an old man who thought he'd outsmarted everyone. He lived 50 years as a free man after taking Jennifer's life. He walked past her memorial, lived in the town where he'd killed her, pretended to be normal while carrying monstrous secrets. But in the end, a cigarette butt he'd tossed aside without thinking became his undoing. The DNA he left behind became the witness that couldn't be silenced or intimidated. Science spoke for Jennifer when she could no longer speak for herself. The case of Jennifer Walsh Springfield, 1974, remains a testament to persistence, to innovation, to the fundamental human need for justice. It's a reminder that we owe it to victims to never stop looking, never stop caring, never stop fighting for answers. Because every person who is killed deserves to be remembered as more than a cold case file number. They deserve to be remembered as who they were: daughters and sons, friends and lovers. People with dreams and futures and lives that mattered. Jennifer Walsh mattered, and 50 years later, justice proved it. Time is the longest distance between two places. Tennessee Williams' Jennifer Walsh lived for 19 years. She has now been remembered for 51. May her memory continue to inspire those who fight for justice today and for all the tomorrows to come. Case closed, but never forgotten.